Welcome to the BIS Innovation Summit. My name is Benoît Queret, and I'm the head of the BIS Innovation Hub. Today is day 2 of the Innovation Summit, and I'm delighted to welcome Brad Smith, president of Microsoft, to open this event and discuss how, and maybe whether, central banks and big tech can work together to serve the public interest. Brad, thank you very much for being with us today.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let me start with a broad question on how Microsoft sees its role in society. You've spent thousands of hours testifying before the US Congress, interacting with governments, with citizen groups around the world. So what role do you see technology firms playing in the digital economy, and where should the line be drawn between the private and the public sector? And yeah.
No, it's a great question. I think for those of us who work in the technology sector, obviously our business is to create technology products and services that we hope will be of use, will be of value, and not just value to the people who apply them directly, but more broadly to society. But I also think that your question asks, in some ways, it asks us to think about something that's far deeper. When we think about how humanity, how we organize ourselves, I really think of it as fundamentally 3 pillars. It starts with the state, with governments, with the public sector. We live in a world, we have lived in a world since the 1600s and the Peace of Westphalia, where territories are controlled by governments. Governments make the laws and pass the rules. They regulate the markets. They protect our freedoms. And in at least half the world, they are elected by the people that they represent. The private sector is in the business of creating products and services and selling them for money. And obviously, you don't have a sustainable role in the private sector unless you're meeting some public need, because otherwise there are not consumers or customers that want to pay you. And we should hopefully be doing something that is of broader societal value. But I think most importantly, private companies need to be subject to the rule of law and ultimately the regulation of the state itself. And then I would say, I think there's a third pillar, if you will, a third leg to the stool for the world today. And that's the non-governmental organizations, the nonprofits, organizations that in some ways fill in the gaps, add to what the state and the private sector are doing. I think oftentimes they help act as the conscience of the world and of interest groups around the world. And ultimately, almost every big problem in the world, including a technology problem, probably requires all 3 legs of the stool: government leadership, private sector action, and non-governmental efforts to support it as well.
But as far as Microsoft is concerned, you're working under the rule of law, that's for sure. But you're also a for-profit organization. So are there instances of tensions or contradictions between working for the public good and being a for-profit organization?
Well, I always like to say, I hope you don't have to work for the public sector in order to be a public service. I think that that it's good for institutions, including companies, to be broad-minded and civically minded. I don't think we should ever think that we know better than people in government, simply because nobody elected us to serve the public the way governments are elected to serve the public. But I do think we have an opportunity in everything we do to ask ourselves whether we're being a public service, whether we're being socially responsible. And I think if we fail to do that, we let ourselves down, and fundamentally we let our customers down. Certainly at Microsoft, we're guided by a mission of empowering others to really put technology to use. And we do use that to remind ourselves, remind our employees of why we exist in the first place.
I have to say, I've got a lot of sympathy for what you just said, and I would really see it as a two-way street. That is, governments and public institutions such as central banks should also not think that they know better than the market, and there is a tendency to do so. So I think it really has to cut both ways.
Yeah, I think that's well put.
And so you've got lots of experience working with the public sector and also working to pursue international goals. You've been instrumental in preparing the Paris and the Christchurch declarations, and there's lots of interesting thoughts in your book about that, and I learned a lot from reading it. So can you share with us some experiences of how do you go around doing that? How do you build consensus, not only with governments but also maybe with your competitors in achieving these kind of objectives?
It is a great question, and it's one that we have learned a lot and are continuing to learn a lot. And like a lot of things, you learn from your experience. One of the examples is the Paris Call. The Paris Call, for those who are not familiar with it, was adopted in 2018 in Paris. It's the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. And it came together actually when President Macron said he would have a peace forum on the centennial of the cessation of hostilities, the armistice that concluded World War I. And he put out a call for ideas. He said he wanted ideas that would represent multilateral initiative and really the principles of democracy that the world had tried to nourish and nurture after World War I. And we thought about it and we said this problem of cybersecurity around the world fits that description. It's a global challenge. It's putting so many people at risk, but it's not the kind of problem that any government can solve by itself. And it's not the kind of problem that either the public or private sector can solve alone. So we developed an idea, a declaration of principles that we thought were really fundamental to the protection of cybersecurity. We brought it to Paris. We shared it with the French government. The government then took it and really led the way, but we supported it. And one of the things we did was encourage others to join in. And here it is, 2021, and 75 governments around the world have signed it. More than 1,000 entities overall have signed it. And I think it has helped really increase momentum for some of the important principles. And then interestingly, 6 months after it came into being, there was the terrible terrorist attack in Christchurch, New Zealand. And I just happened to be in New Zealand a few weeks afterwards, and Prime Minister Ardern wanted to seize the initiative and turn that tragedy into something that would bring some good to the world. And so we got to talking about whether we could replicate what had happened in the Paris Call, but this time around the protection of the internet against that kind of violent extremism. And that became the Christchurch Call, led by the New Zealand and French governments again, but now signed by more than 50 governments and signed by major tech companies. And we all work together to try to ensure that the internet is not used as a platform to spread violent extremism.
And what about your competitors? I mean, how do you bring them to align?
Yeah, that's an excellent point. One of the things that I think is so valuable about the Christchurch Call is it has most of our competitors. Amazon is there, Google is there, Facebook and Twitter are there. And it really stands for the proposition that ironically in life, you people can focus so much on just winning tomorrow against your competitor. I think you lose sight of the broader ties that bind you together. And I think we have to strive to live in a world where you bring out the best in yourself by competing. We say we compete with some of the best athletes in the world. That's the nature of the tech sector. And yet there are days when we must set those differences aside and work together for a greater good. It is not always easy. The tech sector is such a rough and tumble, fast-moving industry. But I think I always say to people at Microsoft, years from now when we're retired, my guess is we'll look back at our careers and we will be most proud of some of the things we did with our competitors. And we can't lose sight of that.
So that brings us to the question of international cooperation, which is very close to the heart of the BIS. I mean, as an international organization, the BIS has a broad membership, and would very much like to act as a convener between its members to pursue common goals. I mean, in our case, that's global financial stability, and supporting central banks in delivering on their mandates. And the Innovation Hub, which we've just created, clearly aims at to play a similar role and bring people together to work on technology, even in areas where central banks may be coming from different places, like cybersecurity or central bank digital currencies, where they have different views. And so there is a lot we can learn from a global firm like Microsoft. And to start with, can big technology firms meet the diverse national preferences and interests of their customers? Say, privacy is probably a good example where you have vast differences in preferences. So how do you go around that?
I think that this question is actually one of the most profound you can ask in the world today, because we live in this world where within a territory, a government is supreme. It rules, it sets the laws that govern every aspect within its territory. But we also live in a world where the most important problems are sometimes global. A virus or carbon doesn't respect borders. And so you need to solve problems in a way that looks beyond borders. Now, we also have the benefit of institutions that go beyond borders. Intergovernmental organizations are one of them. Private companies and NGOs are others. And so I think when you're in this kind of role, you have to really balance two things that are very different from each other. You have to start by identifying those causes and principles that are truly global. You have to ground yourself in them, and you have to find ways, I think, to bring people together around a bold ambition that they can find unifying and even inspiring. And at the same time, you have to respect the local needs of a community, of a market, or of a country and a government. So I think your point about privacy is a very good one. I think that fundamentally what we strive to do is identify certain privacy protections that we think are genuinely global, and we organize our business around them. But we also recognize that we have to localize the way we work, and we have to adapt in many instances to the needs and at times even the rules and laws of local countries. And only by doing both of these things, almost as these two layers together, I think, are we able to succeed. But for me, the learning is when you can really figure out how to do that, that's when you unlock the potential to solve bigger problems around the world.
But aren't there two sides to the same coin? That is, as a global company, you're well placed to reach customers everywhere and to achieve a global level playing field. But the same customers, as citizens, could see you as footloose and disconnected from local politics and less legitimate.
I think that's a fair observation. And it's why I think those of us in the private sector always need to start with the recognition that, frankly, governments lead, we follow. The market plays a very powerful role, but the best markets in the world are regulated, healthy markets. And we need to remember that in some ways our first responsibility is to adapt to, in some ways it's the same thing, either adapting to the needs of local customers because they won't buy our products if we fail to do so. And we need to adapt to the demands, requirements of local governments, the local laws and regulations, because if we fail to do so, we won't have that license to do business. So it's always about thinking broadly and thinking locally and deeply at the same time.
And what happens if governments disagree or even conflict in the Westphalian world you were describing? There are issues where governments do disagree. Privacy, which we've mentioned, might be one. Cybersecurity is a case in point, with threats increasingly coming from nation states. There is a lot today about technological sovereignty, technological dominance. So when you're caught in that kind of crossfires, what do you do?
Well, first of all, that is the great challenge that we face. For somebody who has a job like mine, I spend an awful lot of my time on these issues where governments are disagreeing. The short answer is there is no substitute for international agreements in the world today. Almost every issue that we face where we see these divergences, I think the ultimate aspiration should be to pursue approaches that will create some consensus across borders between governments. I think that often starts at more of a regional level. That's one of the reasons the European Union is so influential. They have that capacity to first think as a continent, and then we can build on that to think as a planet. And it's why an organization like the BIS is so important as well. Now, obviously, we can't wait and just set problems aside. We have to manage through them. And there are days when we're forced to go to court or we're forced to take a stand, and we do. Especially on an issue like privacy, where there is currently some discord between Europe and the United States. Basically, we say, look, the first principle that matters is the principle that governs somebody's data. If there's a data that belongs to a European citizen or company, then we think European law should govern that, not the law of some other country. And therefore, we will follow the European law for European data. And if we have to go to court, or even if we have to be fined by a country somewhere else, that's the risk that we'll run. But as you can see, that's a poor substitute for securing ultimately some level of international consensus.
So that's the kind of balance that the Cloud Act in the US aims at achieving, but not everyone likes it in Europe and other places. So is it a useful first step, or can it still be improved?
Oh, it is. The interesting thing about something like the Cloud Act is it really does three things. It says that U.S. law can seek to reach data that is important to the U.S. government in a different location, but it gives a company like Microsoft the ability to go to a U.S. court and object on comity grounds to a U.S. search warrant. And most importantly, it gives the executive branch in the United States the authority to go negotiate international agreements. So to me, every day we get up and we just, frankly, go to work trying to encourage governments to use this, to put international agreements in place. It's another example of the fact that until that happens, and until, frankly, governments put more resources and leadership in doing that, the rest of us are left with a second best solution.
I think we at the BIS, we have no competence when it comes to data regulation, but we would certainly agree that there is no substitute to cooperation between governments, and that's what we can support and we can help, but that has to take place, and at the end it's a political discussion, and it has to be.
Yes, clearly.
So, Brad, can I take you one step closer to what the BIS does, which is finance? And there has been much discussion recently on the role of big tech companies in finance. And it seems that the old dividing line between banking and commerce is increasingly being blurred. The BIS has written a lot on this issue and on how big tech stepping into finance can change regulatory approaches. And we've seen new initiatives such as Facebook's DM putting the whole discussion under a sharper focus and triggering strong political and regulatory reactions. So let me start with the question of data, which is a key commodity in today's finance. Tech firms have become the custodians of the world's data, including data from governments and from central banks. How can you ensure that you remain trustworthy as a custodian?
Well, first of all, I think that the question itself is really important. And I've often talked with our employees at Microsoft by analogizing to the role of banks. People need to have confidence in order to deposit their money with banks. They need to have confidence to deposit their data with tech companies and other institutions that have access to it. And I think when you frame it that way, what immediately becomes apparent, at least to me, is that tech companies will sustain that level of trust only by two things. The first is the companies themselves have to act in a trustworthy way. And I think that means that we need to be principled. We need to define our principles. We need to then be public about them. We need to explain them. At Microsoft, we sort of start with this concept that we are the stewards of our customers' data. We are not the owners of it. And we don't have an unlimited license to use it however we wish. We need to be responsive and responsible to our customers. And that also requires a huge amount of transparency, that we not only say what we want to do, but we show people, and we have transparency reports that in part go to showing how we work. But I also think that it would be, frankly, unrealistic and even naive for tech companies or anybody else to think that we can sustain the world's trust in the management of data through the goodwill and good deeds of companies alone. For the same reason that history has shown that financial markets need to be regulated in order to be stable and trustworthy, technology and data needs to be regulated as well. Privacy needs to be regulated. It needs to be governed by the rule of law. This is why we've been an advocate now for 16 years in the United States of adopting a strong national privacy law. I think that until we get both responsible private sector action and strong laws around the world, we're going to be operating at sort of a trust deficit when it comes to how people think about data.
But regulation tends to operate in silos, which is as much an issue for us on the regulatory side than it is for the industry. And one might argue that the line between financial regulation and data regulation, or even antitrust or competition regulation, is also being blurred. So just to give you an example, one issue central banks have been struggling with is that increasingly tech firms are becoming critical service providers for financial firms, say by providing cloud services, and as such are becoming nodes of in the propagation of financial shocks, to the point where there might be a temptation for financial regulators to also seek to become regulators of tech firms. So how do we go around this increasingly complex and I would say jaded landscape?
Well, interestingly, when we first started getting closer to, I'll say, the data services and technology needs of financial services institutions, this was about 10 to 12 years ago. One of the first things we recognized was that this part of the market could not evolve, it couldn't innovate unless there was movement together by financial regulators, financial institutions, and tech companies. So one of the first things we did was hire some lawyers who really understood financial regulations. We didn't have them at a company like Microsoft, 12 or 15 years ago. And we see our role as providing technology tools and services that financial institutions can use to advance their business. But oftentimes I find myself traveling in the days when I can at least travel in person, and meeting with the head of a central bank and talking about the need for, say, local regulations to move forward, to think about the role of cloud services. To do so, I think always with this first principle or set of principles around protecting the integrity of our financial markets, but making it easier for the institutions themselves, the banks, the other institutions, to put this technology to work, and then for us, to provide those technology tools in an appropriate way. And so what you're really describing, and I think your reference to silos captures it very well, is that in the world today, every part of the economy that is in part regulated will have a layer that will in fact involve data regulation and technology regulation. So there will be these vertical silos. And at the same time, there are some horizontal principles that we have the opportunity to develop, to share. And it doesn't mean they'll all be applied the same way across every part of the economy, but I think there are real opportunities for every part of the economy to benefit, so to speak, from each other's experience.
And so after talking to all these governors and financial regulators, what do you take home? I mean, are we doing a good job at connecting the dots, or should we try harder to reach out to data regulators?
Well, I mostly have been encouraged. I think that one of the things that has been interesting to me, and perhaps would not be surprising to the people who are watching this, but it was to me initially, was that the financial institutions were reluctant to move ahead of the regulators. When you come from the world of technology, you basically grow up in a world where the market is moving and then the regulators try to catch up. But the first thing that we learned was that the regulators in some instances really needed to move ahead of, say, the banks themselves. And that really required a different kind of conversation. We've seen that kind of conversation spread around the world. But even now, as we're building data centers in new countries, one of the first conversations I often have is with the major financial institutions, with the head of the central bank, and really explore whether the regulations are in place so that the banks can move to the cloud if we make this enormous capital investment to build data centers. The path is clear. I mean, we're no longer in a place where you're doing it for the first time. So it is easier for people to learn from others' experiences, but that wave has not yet run its course. It's still moving around the world.
No, and a fascinating playing ground today is payments, right? Where regulators have been pushed by tech firms, and they are now kind of taking the lead and trying to take back control in different ways in different countries to form a vision of where the payment industry should go. Which brings me to what may sound as a provocative question, but can tech firms be trusted to issue money? Is that the place where Microsoft would go?
It is not a place where we have gone, and I don't think it's a place we will go. When Facebook launched its initiative, you referred to that a few minutes ago. We were not part of that. I think that the first question that the world needs to ask is the world served best when private companies issue their own currency? And there's plenty of examples in history, including from the history of the United States, when there were currencies that were issued by private actors, or they were issued by states rather than our national government. Really just speaking for myself, I believe that the world is best served when currencies are issued, backed by, and regulated by governments. I think, for any good or service in the world, we have the opportunity to ask, is it really best pursued as a public good or as a private good? And I just think, given the fact that when you issue currency, you create a money supply, the money supply, I think, almost uniquely needs to be managed by an entity that is responsible to the public and thinks really only about the public interest, and that it means governments. I think it needs to be managed by an institution that has the right kind of regulatory authority. So I'm not a big fan myself of encouraging or asking or wanting us to participate in the issuing of currency. I think that the world has been better served by what has been a movement over actually centuries to put that in the hands of governments.
Yeah, I guess the balance we'll have to strike in the coming years will be to have this sense of sovereignty of money that you were describing, while at the same time not losing the benefits of innovation, which is best provided by the private sector.
Yeah, there's plenty of room for a company like Microsoft to create technology tools that facilitate payments. To create so-called commerce systems that can, put technology to work in some ways to do what it does best, which is take some of the friction out of a market to lower the costs of providing a service and creating these enormous economies of scale that technology can put to work. So that is something that we do, and we do it for our customers. We certainly create technology that we hope that the world's financial institutions will want to procure from us and put to work. And while at the same time, frankly, we want to make clear we're not a bank. We don't want to become a bank, and we don't want to compete with our customers who are banks. And we think that the financial markets of the world work best when they're regulated by governments and the currencies themselves are issued by and managed by and regulated by governments.
So Brad, this has been a fascinating discussion. I would like to thank you very much for sharing your insights with us. And thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for what you're doing in the Innovation Hub. And thank you for what I know all of the people who are watching this do. One of the amazing things about money is it's, I guess, a little bit like data. The world would not move forward without it. So thank you very much.
Thank you.